This week we are beginning the book of Deuteronomy in our annual prayer cycle, our annual Torah reading cycle. And I need to confess that Deuteronomy was always my favorite book when I was growing up in religious school. But honestly, it was mostly because I thought the name was the most fun to say. And I should be honest that I said it was most of the reason, but I really didn't know anything that was in the book. So that was really the only reason that I liked Deuteronomy, because it was fun to say. But about that name, all the rest of the books, they are pretty straightforward. Genesis, that is about the beginning of things. Exodus, that is about leaving things. Leviticus, that may throw you for a little bit till you deconstruct it and see that the root there is Levi, as in the tribe of Levi, as in the priestly class in Israel, in the Israelite community. And then Numbers, well, Numbers starts with a census, with counting, so there you go. But Deuteronomy, there's not so much in the way of context clues when it comes to figuring out what Deuteronomy is supposed to be. And that word Deuteronomy, it's actually a Greek word based off of one of the Hebrew names for this book, Mishnah HaTorah, which means repetition of the Torah. Deuteronomy, the Greek, deutero means second, and nomi or nomos, that means law. So in other words, the title tells us, whether in that Hebrew or the Greek translation, that this book is a retelling or a recounting of what we have already read, what we should already know. And reading through this opening parsha, that title fits. Deuteronomy is framed as Moses standing on the side of the Jordan River, addressing the Israelites for what is to be the last time. He is summarizing what they and their ancestors experienced that led them to this moment on the edge of the promised land. And it's worth sharing some of the stories that Moses recounts, some of the experiences that he retells. He talks about how he told the Israelites to pick leaders from their tribes who would then go to assist Moses when it came to making decisions. Moses talks about how the Israelites came to Moses and said, "Moses, send scouts to the promised land to see what the land is like so we know before we go there." And Moses recounts how when those scouts returned, all of them, except for Caleb, said that the land was full of giants and that they, if they enter it, will be destroyed. When I was in rabbinical school, I spent a summer as a counselor for the Reform Movement's high school Israel trip. It's the very same trip a number of our students are on right now. As the rabbinical student in the group, it was my job to handle all of the Jewish stuff. But there was one occasion where I was working with an Israeli on putting together some kind of program. And she was looking for a particular prayer and not having much luck. Finally, in frustration, she threw down the book and said, I need a real prayer book. I need a real prayer book. This was the Reform Movement's trip. The book that she threw down was this one, our book. I gotta be honest, that hurt. It hurt enough that I can still remember it 11 years later. It hurt, even though I knew exactly what she meant. Here at Temple, we use the Shabbat-only version of this book, but there is a full one that the movement publishes, which is right here, and you can see it's quite a bit thicker. It is 694 pages, if you are wondering. You are welcome that we ordered the smaller ones for people to hold when they are here. 694 pages, but here is an Orthodox prayer book. This one, 1,244 pages. And unlike ours, it does not have contemporary interpretive readings on most every other page. I think the reason her response had such a profound impact was because it was more about than just the book. She was expressing the most common critique about Reform Judaism. It's that y'all leave out stuff that needs to be there, and you put stuff in that shouldn't. It's saying, I don't see the prayers, the ones I expect, and I don't understand why I see all of these poems. Maybe her saying that hurt because a year into rabbinical school, a part of me thought, maybe she's right. Maybe this isn't a real prayer book. In the spirit of Deuteronomy, let's read again about the stories that Moses tells. In the first one, he talks about the time when the Israelites were overwhelming him with their demands, so he tells them to pick leaders so he could have some help. Except, if we look at the original story as it's told in the book of Exodus, it's told a bit different. In that telling, it's Moses' father-in-law, Yitro, who tells Moses that he needs help and who tells Moses what he needs to do. And then it's Moses, not the people, who ultimately picks the leaders that are going to help him. When it came to the sending of the scouts, here Moses reminds the people they demanded scouts to go and explore the land and see what it was like. But back in the book of Numbers, when it happens, the text says, God spoke to Moses and said, send men to scout the land. God sent the scouts. And when Moses praises Caleb for being the one scout who, upon returning, remained loyal to God and faithful and didn't fear the coming battles, well, again, if we look back in Numbers, Caleb is praised for his loyalty alongside Joshua, who is not mentioned here in Deuteronomy. These are far from the only examples of Moses' retelling not quite lining up with the original versions. So what are we to do with these discrepancies? We could do what the tradition does, and that is finding ways to square these circles. For example, the Midrash teaches that when in Numbers God tells the Israelites to send the scouts, according to Midrash, what really happened was first the Israelites came and said, send the scouts, and for whatever reason the Torah just skipped that little part of the story and picks up where God and Moses respond to them and say, we're sending scouts. That is the traditional explanation for how you can reconcile these two tellings. With enough thought and enough time, you can explain away seemingly any potential contradiction. But there are other options for what we can do with these discrepancies. We could see Moses in human terms. And humans, as hopefully we realize in ourselves, we don't always remember things quite the way they happened. Moses here, he is recounting events, some of which were decades ago, and at the time he is pushing 120. It is perfectly plausible for Moses to forget that there was not one, but there were two loyal scouts. It's also plausible for him to recount the story that he wanted to be true. The father-in-law shaming him to hire some helpers turns into, in Moses' mind, Moses telling the people, I told you all to choose leaders for yourself. It was my idea, and I did it and executed it in the best, fairest possible way by allowing you to pick those leaders yourselves. Looking at these discrepancies through the lens of imperfect memory, it is a plausible way to explain the differences that we read. And it's certainly relatable to our own lived experience. We all have some version of the memory of being 4 years old and getting to do something awesome like, ride in a hot air balloon, only to find out later in life that, no, we had never actually ridden in a hot air balloon. We just watched a movie about someone who did. And I say that as someone who did get to ride in a hot air balloon as a child. At least I think I did. And yes, it's fun to think Moses was like us, but what does that really teach us? And the answer is not much. So one final idea from Professor Tammy Schneider, writing in the Torah, a Women's Commentary. She suggests Moses isn't actually retelling history here. He's doing something entirely different. He is reinterpreting history. As Professor Schneider notes, many of these interpretations put more power into the hands of the people, They appointed their judges and their leaders. They made the decision to send scouts to the land. Maybe that's not quite what actually happened. But maybe, in that time and place, that was the Torah that they needed. They needed Torah that could guide them as they prepared to lose Moses as their leader, as they prepared to enter the land of Israel, as they prepared to lead themselves. Professor Schneider notes, in an ironic and in a Jewish way, the Torah has already begun to be interpreted within the text. I want to repeat that. In an ironic and a Jewish way, the Torah has already begun to be reinterpreted within the text. The Torah is reinterpreting itself. As a new rabbinical student, I did not have a response to the accusation that my prayer book was not a real prayer book. But now I do. On a technical level, I could say that the prayer book, no matter which one, it is a commercial innovation. The Jewish prayer service had an outline for generations, but the exact words were said differently from community to community and from person to person. That is, until the printing press came along and publishers collected specific versions of prayers, bound them all together, and sent them out into the world. And when they did so, they declared, one version is right, and all the rest are wrong. That is one response. And in my imagination, this hapless Israeli is just riveted by my rebuttal and eager for more. So I would say this as well. It is not correct to think Judaism has ever remained constant. And even if that were possible, even if the tradition had been unchanged, I am not sure that is something that we would want. We need a religion that isn't an instruction book for getting through the Bronze Age. We need a religion that can speak to the here and the now of our lives. We need prayers and we need poems that resonate with who we are and speak to us. And to say that is not something heretical, and it is not something to be ashamed of. No, it is integral to Judaism. Not just because there is historical evidence that this kind of change and innovation has happened from Judaism's founding, but because we have a Torah right there that has a fifth book in it, Deuteronomy, that retells and reinterprets the previous four. Retells and reinterprets for the age they lived in, the Israelites in the time of Deuteronomy. And if they needed their own interpretation, how much more so do we? For us to do anything less than to reinterpret, reinvent, and reevaluate our religion would be the most un-Jewish act of all. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will.